when your capacities are waning, when your powers are waning, you are still someone who has been commissioned by God, and God has made a promise to do something in and through your continued existence. So just in virtue of you being present, God is at work in and through your life.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Daniel Hill. Welcome, Dr. Hill.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with y'all.
It's good to have you. You're no stranger to the G3 Project. You were with us for Courageous Conversations. You were brave enough to sit at that table, the hot seat, to talk about something so easy, hell. I mean, you can't get an easier subject than hell. For those who don't know who you are, Dr. Hill, just tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm Daniel Hill, one of many Daniel Hills, unfortunately. I was born outside Chicago. I became a Christian at the Hampton University, the real HU. For all those Howard, watchers out there. And became a Christian in college, moved down to Houston, where I taught for a couple of years in a middle school, and then went to seminary. And I attended Dallas Seminary for 4 years while working for a church, and then moved up to Wheaton College, where I did a PhD with Mark Cortez and helped start a school up there. And then I teach now at Dallas Theological Seminary here in Dallas, Texas. So I've been kind of orbiting all around the country and have landed back in the land of Tex-Mex.
Well, today we're going to be talking about something as easy as hell. What does it mean to be human? Tell our audience, there is a fancy theological term for it, but I think the gist of it is what it means to be human. Tell our audience a little bit about how that fleshes out theologically.
Yeah, so there are a lot of folks who have a lot of things to say, a lot of different disciplines about what it means to be a human creature, and they all have valuable contributions. So sociologists on one hand and biologists on another. Philosophers of mind, neuroscientists, they all can contribute to telling you about what it means to be a human being, as opposed to a eukaryote or a orca. But when we talk about a human creature, we're making a theological claim. We're saying that we are not self-existent, that we were made by a creator and are defined in relationship to that creator. And so from there come a whole host of different questions and concerns that theological anthropology tries to engage. What is work, vocation? What is the meaning of marriage, singleness? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Why do human beings have dignity, et cetera, et cetera? And that all kind of ties in and falls under this heading of, no, we're not just one. Well, we are, in one sense, just one of many creatures, but there's something unique about us. And what is that unique thing? And so theological anthropologists such as myself try and flesh that out.
Mm-hmm. So the $1 million question is, what does it mean to be made in the image of God?
Yeah, that is the question of questions. I was reading Theodore Wright a couple of days ago, and Maria Stewart this morning, honestly. They both are abolitionists in the 18th century, or 19th century, sorry. And they're both making this claim, hey, I deserve freedom. My people deserve freedom because I'm an image bearer of God. And of course, why do you have to make that claim? And what does it mean is the question. So there are three typical answers. One is what we call the substantial approach, saying that there's some property you possess that differentiates you from all the other creatures, whether it's reason or righteousness or something like that, rationality. Another is to say it's relational, so that you exist in relationships. You image the Trinity, just like God is this community of relationships, so are human beings. And then the last approach is the functional, which is that you have a particular vocation God has given you, that he sent you out to be his priests, kings in creation. I take a bit of a hybrid view, which is I'm coining the mediatorial or instrumental account, which is to say that God has given a particular vocation, but it's a promise of what he will do in and through us, as opposed to a task we carry out based on some capacities we have. That God has promised to make his word, his presence, and his rule known in and through human creatures.
Flush that out a little bit for our audience, and how does that connect with them on an everyday basis?
Yeah, I think one of the most practical, and this, I'm sorry in advance, is going to be a little dark. One of the most practical ways that it fleshes itself out in my book is we all are going to have, we all have a bunch of powers and capacities. So reasoning, or walking around, most of us, not everyone, but a lot of people have these varying capacities. But what we tend to forget is that they're all going to wane. Eventually you're going to grow old, and your rationality is going to fade. Your powers of movement are going to be restrained and restricted. And some folks, that's their condition, their entire existence. So if you have muscular dystrophy or severe cognitive impairment, you don't have these kind of what we would say normal powers of movement. And I'm using scare quotes around the word normal. And so what that can suggest is that, well, if this person can't reason, are they in the image of God? Or an infant or someone with dementia, are they still in the image of God if they've lost the power of reason? And so I think my approach, one of the goods it has, besides I think that I could make the argument through the scriptures of how we are made in the image of God, whereas Jesus Christ just is the image of God, but that's a larger conversation, is when your capacities are waning, when your powers are waning, you are still someone who has been commissioned by God, and God has made a promise to do something in and through your continued existence. So just in virtue of you being present, God is at work in and through your life.
That's helpful, because I think, I wouldn't have thought about, people losing certain capabilities, people thinking these people are not made in the image of God, because the way you define it shapes how, if you lose certain things, how people could kind of redefine it in a sense.
Yeah.
Are you following me in what I'm saying? So that's a fantastic point that you brought out. As you were talking, I began to think about like the development of AI and robots. Have you thought through how this conversation will impact the next generation of technology? Have you did any work with that?
No, I honestly haven't. I've done most of my work going the opposite direction. So I always ask one of my students, like, if someone served you orangutan, would you eat it? Why or why not? And trying to gesture at, an orangutan might be able to reason a little bit better than an infant. Infants don't have object permanence, but I think that's one of the, it'll be an interesting question folks are going to have to wrestle with, is at this point, it seems to be the case that we can program technology to carry out functions that we've told it to do. So the best chess player in the world can't beat a computer at this point. But the computer couldn't create something new on its own in the way that chess player, potentially could. So it'll be interesting to see how these conversations get brought into dialogue with, okay, so we've got, robots walking around, or in Japan, I saw a couple months ago that they have robots stocking shelves. How do you adjudicate between robot and human rights? It's going to be an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, definitely. When we think about personhood, what do you think the biggest challenge in that conversation is?
Yeah, I think on a academic level, it's trying to define what is personhood. On a more lay level, outside of the kind of ivory tower, it's what are we tend to think more about rights than about duties. So what are there specific duties that come with being a person, that I should perhaps seek the flourishing of other persons is kind of part and parcel of my responsibility as a person. I think that kind of framework even then shapes how we understand things like rights and understand things like dignity. But I think one of the hardest things for folks to wrestle with is, okay, well, what are my rights? What are the extent of those rights? Where are those rights located? What are they based in? What happens when my rights, rub up against someone else's rights? yeah, where are the kind of boundaries of my person, and how much do I have responsibility over?
So I'll ask you those questions.
Okay.
What are what are the boundaries of your what person, and what do you have responsibility over?
Yeah. So I would prefer to talk more in terms of duties, um,
Mhm,
because there's a sense in which you are a this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but you're a host. You know, you've got organisms that aren't a part of you that are just kind of along for the ride that you need to take care of. So there's some bacteria in your gut that if you aren't kind to, it won't help you with the digestive process. Um, and so you have to be responsible for caring for that things. Um, but yeah, so I would say one of the duties of a person, is to care for to seek the flourishing of other persons.
mhm,
Insofar as it's possible. Of course, there are uh, boundaries on our ability to, if someone has an advanced stage of cancer, I can't cure that cancer. That's not really within my capacities. And so some of my duties are going to be restrained and limited. But I think one of our, because we kind of sit in a nexus of relationships, so I have responsibilities to seek the good of those around me and to view my flourishing as tied to theirs.
mhm. I think that gives us into the justice conversation, right?
Yeah.
Because when people don't see the flourishing as other of others as a part of their duty, then injustice begins to flourish.
Yeah.
How have you seen that conversation? What is the intersection between your research and justice work?
Yeah, so I look a little bit into. I'm doing some work right now in the abolitionary era. I've kind of already shouted out Theodore Wright and Maria Stewart, but David Ruggles would be another one that I've done some reading in and writing on. And you frequently see that there's a tendency to denigrate the humanity of someone else as a uh, kind of rite of passage to do whatever you want to them.
Mhm,
So in the 1700s and 1800s, it was pretty much accepted that people with darker skin, if you can catch my drift, are were uncultured, lacking in virtue, and fit only to be enslaved, or they couldn't learn civility, is what Immanuel Kant says. So it's like all that they're governed by their passions. They can be disciplined and taught to behave, but they can't attain to culture, is what he says, and they can't create things. Well, what you've kind of done is you've set up a little hierarchy and saying, well, no, so I have more humanity, or I'm a higher evolved human than these other people. So I can kind of do what I want with them. And you see some just absolutely horrendous things that were done all over the world based on this kind of cosmic hierarchy that's established based on denigrating someone else's humanity. And somewhat like very surprising activity that doesn't actually, you would think, how does this make sense? But we are creative in our wickedness.
mhm. That's very true. I think, I always say the only way to treat somebody poorly is the first without guilt, is to first dehumanize them. So
Yeah.
we see this, in order for someone to feel less guilty, they have to make the object or who they're engaging less human. That is slavery. What
Mhm.
was the thing? We were 3/5 of a person. To strip away our personhood was to strip away the guilt of them treating us the way they treat us. If
Yeah.
you think about like uh, the abortion argument, that there's a major push to say this isn't a baby, this is a fetus. Because if it is a person,
Mhm.
then it brings a level of guilt to
Yeah.
harm a person that looks like you or that bears the image of God just like you. So it is really big to how we frame that image of God conversation, because if we don't see people as fellow image bearers, we give ourselves the license to treat them any way we want without guilt, because they're not human like us.
Yeah. And some of it is just, I don't, surprising is the only word that I can think of. And I don't mean to just kind of cast aspersion, but there was a law in Louisiana. It was a concubinage law in so predominantly Christian environment. There's a law where you can have concubines as long as it's less than, I think it was 80% of your net worth.
Mm,
And you're like, well, you don't think this is a person. So what are you doing with this non-person? Like, you don't think this is a human being on the same level as you.
mhm,
And yet you are sexually assaulting them.
mm,
So much so that there are abolitionists who are arguing against slavery based on the amount of sexual assault happening on plantations. So Henry Highland Garnett does that. Maria Stewart does it. David Ruggles. They all make this reference to, hey, look at all this. Look at all these marriages that are being absolved. All this adultery that's taking place. All this rape that's taking place. But this is happening with folks who are like, yeah, and this person I'm assaulting, they're not fully human like I am. And you're like, wait, what? That doesn't. What are you doing? Yeah.
that's a great point to bring up because there is a hypersexualization around Black bodies throughout history, and it is almost as if there is a reworking of history, not to understand that one of the most uh, consistent perpetuators of violence against and sexualizing Black bodies was not Black people, but it was slave masters who raped women and men. Um, and so, can you talk a little bit? I want to definitely make sure people that are listening, if you have trauma around this, that
Yeah.
you may need to turn this off. But can you talk about a little bit about like that research? Because I think most people don't know about that, and in turn they have kind of this view that is not helpful, like the reason why families were split up, the reason why there's so many things around their history that most people don't know.
Yeah. It's really tragic, and I would say even embarrassing. Some of the things that happened. So if you've ever seen Birth of a Nation, the first Birth of a Nation, not the one about Nat Turner, but the one from like 19 something, early 1900s, you see it's like this man in blackface is like running around chasing this woman, and she's trying to get away from him. And there are a number of tropes that is echoing, from tropes being a literary device, a depiction, a way of depicting people. And so for Black men, it typically fell into either what we would call the Mandingo trope or the Sambo trope. So Sambo, you've seen in Looney Tunes movies. I mean, Looney Tunes films from the 80s and 70s of, you know, some man playing and playing the piano, eating watermelon, playing keys, and dancing for his master. The Mandingo, though, is the one who's like sexually pursuing and a threat to, the um, non the non-slaves, the non-black folk. And you have the similar thing for Black women, similar tropes. We have the mammy figure and the Jezebel being depicted as this Black woman who's a seductress and just overpowers her master with her, feminine wilies, and the mammy figure being like a secondary mother figure. And these are ways of showing that. I mean, it's kind of honestly, it's just echoing what I said about, uh, our folks with darker hued skin, black skin, just governed by their passions and
Mhm.
unable to restrain them. Are they just these like kind of bestial figures that you have to, corral and restrain, or they're going to ruin society? It's kind of just echoing that, but maybe about 200 to almost 300 years later, just repeating that same kind of language.
Mm. Yeah, that is definitely important for our audience to know, and how people were portrayed in that time, and how those portrayals still affect how people are viewed now, to denigrate their identity and personhood.
Mm.
So I thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
What other things that we haven't talked about around theological anthropology that you would want our audience to know? That you think is important for them to know about this subject?
Yeah, I would say the two things that I think are pretty pertinent that people need to kind of maybe spend more time thinking about. One would be the issue of how identity is formed. Um, and we tend to think of ourselves as kind of autonomous or self derived, But theological anthropology is the first thing you are is a creature who is loved and upheld by God. Like that's the most important thing about you. And that's not to denigrate or diminish any of your other, unique facets of who you are. I'm from the greatest city in the world, outside Chicago. I'm sorry to anyone else who's not from there, but that's a wonderful way that God has made me, with a love for deep dish pizza and the Chicago Cubs, and a fan of Michael Jordan. No, I'm mostly joking, but there are unique things about you that are good. Particular things about you: your height, your eye color, your hair texture. But all those things are indicative, I would say, of the loving care of God, the one who has formed you and loves and numbers the hairs on your head. And it's important to think of yourself as someone who is known and loved by God. The second thing I would say is how we think and talk about disability, which ties into theological anthropology a bit. We tend to think that human capacities are indicative of usefulness, and so people without those capacities are less useful and therefore less valuable. And so, for example, if someone can't speak, we think, well, how can they pray? How can they interact with God? Someone who doesn't have my level of cognition, how can they have a meaningful relationship with God? And I think it's important to pay attention to how we talk about disability and how we think about folks who have disabilities, because that's not a problem. That is not a problem on God's end of the spectrum. He tells Moses pretty blatantly in Exodus 4, "Who made you? So don't tell me what I can and can't do in and through you." And I think that there are ways in which we interact with those who have disabilities that should be reflective of the fact that God is manifesting his word, his rule, and his presence through them. And so it's not just that I need to go out and serve someone who's blind or serve someone who is deaf, but that I need them. I need them to show me things about God.
Yeah, that's powerful. What books would you recommend on this subject, and how can people find you on social media?
All right. Some books I would recommend. That's good. John Swinton has a book called Becoming Friends of Time, which is about disability, and it's expensive, but it's really good. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my beloved advisor. May his work flourish in perpetuity. And Mark Cortez has a couple books on Christological anthropology. That is why it's important to look at Jesus as the kind of foundation of what it means to be human. And so he has two books. One is called Resourcing Christological Anthropology. He has actually 3 or 4 books on it, so I won't name them all. But Mark Cortez would be another name to look out for. And then Rowan Williams has a little book called Being Human, which is really good. It's short, but it's really good. And Francis Young, Francis with an ES, has some good stuff on being human and disability as well. If you want to find me on social media, my handle is at Danny Hills 33, because there are a lot of Daniel Hills out there. So DANNY HILLS 33.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for joining us. It's been a wonderful time. I appreciate you for taking the time to be with us to talk about what it means to be human. And also, I loved how you fleshed out the end about how it connects to those who have disabilities, because I think people don't often think of that in the conversation. So thank you for including that. Well, this has been another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, you can get our book, our curriculum, Through Eyes of Color, a contextualized guide to helping you know what you believe and why. On our website, you can take online courses and you can become a monthly financial partner, all at jude3project.org. And remember, here at the Jude 3 Project, we're helping you to know what you believe and why you believe it. Until next time, grace and peace, and God bless.